Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Right, you're a scientist. So let's say, and I will not be taking follow up questions. Let's say that I needed to set a lot of things on fire and I wanted to all be green fire. That is a critical part of this. So I remember from when I watched Game of Thrones, when that was all of the rage on the TVs. God, do you remember actually watching shows like a week at a time? It was kind of nice. It was nice.
You know, like you didn't get it all at once. But yes, when everybody was watching Game of Thrones, which was the style at the time.
It was the style at the time. That they spent a little while setting up, like, they've got this thing called wildfire, and it's like super dangerous and super scary. And then there's, I think in the early part of the show, there's like a big scene where they like burn down an entire armada with it, right? So it's fire that water apparently doesn't extinguish, which is useful if you want to set things on fire that are out in the water, handy. And then toward the end of the show, don't they like fill a building with it? And it's like a whole thing, right? So it is both like explosive, but also fire, but it's also like green and has some sort of magical properties. And the more I thought about it, the more I was just like, Game of Thrones is like a pretty simple magic system, right? There is like magic stuff in the universe, but like there aren't wizards. Like people don't just walk around casting spells. So it's not like that kind of like D&D style magic. So what is wildfire, and how do I get some for reasons I'm not going to elaborate on?
Yeah, no follow-up questions. Well, darn it, Lions. I'm a chemist, not a magic chemist. But with my very limited knowledge and very limited expertise, I will attempt to apply to this. And the scene that you're talking about towards the end when they blow up the Septum Baelor is one of my favorites because Marjorie...
Is that the church? They like blow up the Vatican?
Yeah, they blew up the Vatican. Yeah. Because basically they're holding a trial there, and Marjorie says, like, Cersei isn't here. And the guy's like, well, then she will, like, still be tried for her crimes. And then she says, no, Cersei isn't here. And she understands what the ramifications of her being here are, which means she never plans on suffering those ramifications. And I'm like, that's a cool way to say that,
Yeah. You hope that they have some kind of afterlife so that their, equivalent of St. Peter could be like, hey, was that good? Like your last moments on Earth, you felt like super clever. Like that was good. You didn't run or anything or like tell anybody else to run. You just were like, wait a minute, like Sherlocking it all out. And then you died in a fire with everybody else.
Palpatine's behind it all.
Somehow Cersei has returned.
But yes, so let's talk about wildfire. So what, from your recollection, are some of the properties of wildfire?
I mean, huge explosions, but also then a persistent burn, right? Because there is, and I'm not a pyrotechnics person, but there's a difference between like a concussive explosive, which causes damage from like a shockwave, and an explosion that like starts a fire, right? Like it creates like a lot of heat and there's like a fireball. And this seems to kind of, you get them all, you get to do both, right? So it explodes stuff. So there's a lot of force, but then all that stuff also is on fire, which is usually not great. If you survive the explosion, you don't want to then be on fire. And critically, whatever it is, either doesn't mix with water or magically burns so hot that the water evaporates around it or something stupid. I don't know. But like because they use it to set ships on fire, and I think the water where the ships sink is then like the surface is on fire. I don't think the fire is ever underwater, right? It's not that level of magic, but like whatever it is now like floating on top of the water and continuing to be on fire.
Well, and actually you make a very salient point, which is that it floats on the water, right? Additional properties. So yes, true on all fronts. Additional properties is it is hot enough to melt stone. And it's poisonous.
Pretty hot.
Yes, that is very hot. It sticks to things, as is seen in the show, and is poisonous if ingested. Which, I mean, kind of duh, but it's not it's not food. But the fact that it floats on the water is actually kind of interesting. So, if you've got something, a liquid that is floating on water, You know what you can generally almost always say about it is
it's lighter than water.
It is. It's less dense, which means it's organic, right? So, and here's the really fascinating thing is that, so if you say, well, organics float on water, they do, unless they're halogenated, in which case then they sink in water. They are more dense than water. So it's just kind of like a cool little litmus test. So like methylene chloride sinks, but whereas gasoline would float on water. And it's just kind of like, oh, that's kind of a neat little barometer for, I know that's an organic. Is it more or less dense than water? I can now tell you some more stuff about it. So with that in mind, with all of those properties, and I think that, this isn't the big reveal because it's fairly straightforward. What weapon of war that we currently have has all of those properties?
I don't know if I would have been able to confidently say all, but I think you may be hinting at napalm.
Yes, napalm has all of those properties, right? Yeah. And the most...
Wait a minute. Napalm is poisonous if ingested?
Well, how about this? Eat a stick of lip gloss and see how you feel afterwards. Because interestingly, lip gloss is made of the same stuff as napalm. And yeah, petroleum jelly.
I'm more upset by that than I would have maybe expected to be.
It's like one of those things where, and of course, the first thing we used it with was to blow stuff up, and then we were like, "Hey, can this do other stuff?" Because that's
hey, it burned that guy's face off, but his lips look so hydrated.
Oh my goodness! Like right before he burst into flames, he looked so like vibrant and full of life before he suddenly very much so wasn't. So yes, absolutely napalm, right? And so, bam, episode over. It's probably napalm, right? But I thought about it and I was like, well, that's not very interesting. And two is that, so ostensibly, if it is napalm, it is something that they have made, right? Like they've got the people who are like, we make wildfire. And they're like, this isn't real. And then they see a bit of it and they're like, oh, it's super real, right? So the question would be, with what we clearly see as with some amount of magic, a medieval level of technology, could they reasonably make napalm or something that approximates napalm? And so that's what we can discuss to see, like, okay, our hypothesis is that it's napalm. Let's test it a little bit, right? So with that in mind, I said that napalm is petroleum jelly. Interestingly, so when you Google and then get on a list, what is napalm made out of? The interesting thing is there is like all sorts of different types of napalm, which I didn't know that, Yeah.
Although not entirely surprising, because like we invented guns for murdering people. And then we were like, no, now we need to iterate on this forever. Like, just give up on all the other important things we could do. We need another version of a gun, right? So when someone said, I made a thing that will light my enemies on fire, I'm sure they got a bunch of grants and everybody was like, oh, we can make chocolate flavored napalm and we can make one that smells like vanilla.
Yes, absolutely yes to all that. And also, too, you made a comment before that I meant to follow up on, which was that there's some explosions where it's the concussive force that's like doing the damage, right? In a lot of explosions, it's not that the explosion is happening; it's what the explosion is throwing at you, right?
Right.
Which is
like shrapnel from a grenade.
Right. Exactly. And I still remember truly being horrified that the point of a grenade, like a classic grenade as we would think of, is not to kill everybody or really anybody. It's to wound them, because then you've got a whole bunch of wounded people that need to be attended to. And that also feels pretty awful. This is going to be a pretty dark episode. So, because, when you talk about weapons of war, nobody said and then I made one that healed everybody.
That's weapons of reconciliation. That comes after.
So interestingly, the first big mass production of napalm, which was around the Vietnam War, was actually made very easily. It's just gasoline, polystyrene, and benzene, which is pretty easy for us to obtain, right? So because like benzene, I mean, you can just go buy benzene. Like it's hazardous, but they'll sell it to you. Polystyrene is, like styrofoam, right? And gasoline, you go get gasoline, right? Ta-da. I say all that, though, to say that easy for us to get, but we're talking about a medieval level society. how are they going to get all that stuff? So first I started with, all right, well, let's start with gasoline. How are they going to get gasoline? So with that in mind, where does gasoline come from?
So you've got like organic matter that gets like compressed into a goo, right? And that would be like oil underground. You got to pump up the oil underground somehow, or like La Brea tar pits or something. Would that count? Is that close enough?
So interestingly, there are instances of oil that you don't need to drill for.
Yeah, I've seen the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah. I mean, like it's if you want to produce gasoline in quantity, you need to be able to drill for it. But as we've seen here, is that there's not overwhelming quantities of this stuff. I mean, like, I think they had like something like 100 barrels of it. And they were like, this is an insane amount of this stuff that you've made. Yeah. And 100 barrels, like we go through that by the end of this sentence.
Yeah. But I don't actually know what is involved in the refinement process, but I do know that oil and gasoline are not the same, right? You can't just take oil straight out of the ground and pump it straight into a car. So there's a refinement process of some kind, removing some stuff, probably adding some stuff like modern additives. And then you have modern style gasoline.
You got it, man. Yep. 10s across the board. So, and the big thing is, so now let's look at Game of Thrones, right? Could they wander around and find crude oil? Absolutely. Right. Because the medieval societies did that. They had crude oil, they just didn't have gasoline. So then the question is, could they reasonably refine it? Well, so the first step of the refining process is distillation. Do you know what distillation is? We kind of covered it before, so it's really more of a test. So if you don't get it right, then
it's separating out things from I think it has to be a fluid, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. But yes, only thing seeing, well, because I guess if you can't distill a solid, you can't really distill a gas. And if it's a mixture of those things, they are already distilled. So I would make the argument that it has to be fluids.
Yeah. So if you think like distilling like salt water, right, you are trying to distill the salt out of the water, so you now have fresh water.
Correct. Yep. And so with distillation,
done with heat. I mean, I guess you could do it with like a complicated chemical process, probably, but they would probably have done it with heat.
Interestingly, I would make the argument that if you did it with anything other than heat, we'd call it something else, So, for example,
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, so if for example, a lot of times, like if you're trying to get salts out of water, you can react them with other stuff that will cause them to precipitate out of that water, but then it's a precipitation, not a distillation, but yeah, very, very good points. It's always interesting when we do this because you will say some stuff where I'm like, I've been doing it for so long that I'm like, I didn't even consider that. But no, yeah, you're right. Like it is exclusive to this thing because why wouldn't it be? But yes. So I say all of that to say that so distillation is specifically what you're doing with the distillation is you've got a mixture of several different fluids that when you apply heat, you can separate them by boiling point, right? So the idea is that you heat it up to the point where one of those two things will boil. It boils off, and then you capture that what's the distillate, on the other side. So to distill out crude oil, there's a lot of stuff in there. So so you basically you ramp it up, and I'm making up numbers here, but you ramp it up to 90 degrees Celsius, and you let it sit, and you capture all the distillate. Then you ramp it up to 110, and you capture all the distillate, and then you so on and so forth, right? Until you've distilled out and separated everything by boiling point.
And is it a short reason that you can't just jump to the highest boiling point of the thing you want, or is it because the thing you want is in the middle?
I think it's that you want all of the things to be their own thing, because it has each part of the crude oil has a use, So if you just wanted to get gasoline, I'm sure you could just ramp it up to just below the gasoline temperature, boil all that stuff off, then just boil off the gasoline, then leave the rest alone. But we use all parts of the crude oil in this house.
Oh boy.
So you distill it out, right? And so through this process, you get gasoline. But interestingly, also during this part of the process is where, if you did it right, you could distill out benzene, which is one of the ingredients that we need. So we kind of covered, can you get a hold of benzene? Yeah, during your distillation process. If you distill out the benzene, now you've got benzene,
And would it be obvious to a medieval society on the macro scale, looking with their dumb animal eyes, like this is a different thing? Or is it, because I'm imagining, like, hypothetically, let's pretend benzene is odorless, colorless, and tasteless. Maybe they think that's water vapor. Like, would they be able to tell that it is something?
So it does have its own properties, right? It most specifically, the easiest one is that it does not share the same density of water. So if you had a liter of it and you weighed it, it would weigh different than water, right? Now, to your question of would they be able to recognize this, I'll touch on that a little bit later, because that's a very salient question of could they physically do it? Yes. Would they do it? Is a different a different question, right? I didn't say they couldn't. I said you shouldn't. So after you distill all this, you go through what's called catalytic cracking, where you take the piece of it that you need and you break it apart so that way everything is of like kind of a uniform molecular size. And then you catalytically convert it so that way it's all of the size now that you want, right? So you kind of break it all into the two-piece Legos, and then you reassemble it so that way all of the Legos are the same length that you want. And then you do, I believe, you blend, and then you add your additives, and then bam, gasoline, right? All of that is things that they would have the equipment to do, right? They would have glassware, they would have ways to apply heat to the glassware, they'd have access to crude oil, and they'd have all that kind of stuff, right? Also, during the distillation process is when you could distill out styrene, right? Interestingly, though, styrene is also available through various tree saps. Contains styrene in sizable quantities, if not exclusively styrene for some of them. So I believe it's like the American gum tree or something like that is like its sap is styrene, and that's actually where we got the name styrene.
That feels wrong. Like, I know you're right. Like, I'm not questioning you, but like, doesn't that feel weird? Like, you think about the container that your Big Mac came in, and you're like, I got the materials from for that tree. And it's like, that doesn't feel right.
Right? Well, it's interesting because one of the things I learned in my polymers course that I thought was kind of fascinating is that when we make polymers like polystyrene, right, is that we always have a mix of molecular weights when we make it, right? So like we set it up so it makes chains of, let's say we're shooting for chains of 1,000 units, right? And we'll get a lot of them that are 1,000 units, and some that are 999, 998, so on and so forth. And it forms a Gaussian distribution typically. The sharper the curve, the better you did, of making the thing. There is only one thing that can make it perfectly always the same length every time. You know what that is?
No.
Nature. Nature can make polymers the exact same way every time, right? So it is kind of weird when you think about it, because it's like, oh, well, sap, that's like tree blood, right? And you're like, well, that can't be, and it's like, yeah, man, it's just styrene, because it that's what it used to do its chemical processes, and it works for it, and it's able to make that in the same way we can make red blood cells or amines and stuff like that, But yeah, very, very fair question, very fair point, right? The sap styrene isn't what we put Big Macs in. The polystyrene is, and the poly is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that.
it is, yeah. Those 4 letters are really contributing to the end product.
Yes, because vinyl chloride is crazy cancerous. Polyvinyl chloride is something we can run drinking water through and then drink it safely. So it'd be funny if somebody said like, hey man, I got a bunch of vinyl chloride in the truck. Polyvinyl chloride? You know what, man? I just need you to come out to the truck. Nope. I need an answer to that. The fact that you're not answering me is giving me the answer. So with all that in mind, right? So we got our crude oil. From that, we got our gasoline. So we got styrene from the gum tree, right? And then creating a polymer off of that just requires some organic catalysts, which they would have access to, right? So we've got polystyrene and we've got benzene. We've got all the ingredients, and you literally just kind of mix them all together in a big jug, and then boom, you got your napalm, right? So then the question that I think that you asked, and we'll deal with the bioluminescent later, because it's also like it's kind of green. Well, actually, we can talk about it now. It's green. Bioluminescent green stuff is everywhere. It would be trivial for them to find this, right?
Put it in this stuff and it doesn't like burn?
Well, they could put it in the stuff. It wouldn't burn because the chemical is very. That's a good question. Is so the chemical itself isn't going to burn it just by touching it. It needs an ignition source, you know. So.
Oh, so by the time the thing that's making it green has gone away, so has the stuff that was on fire.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it makes it green, and then as the napalm burns, as the wildfire burns, it does burn away the green eventually, you know. But yeah, so it's the molecules themselves for napalm. The mixture itself is a very energetic mixture, but until you start breaking those bonds and getting at that sweet chemical energy that's inside, you know, it's relatively stable. You know, just don't smoke near it. So yes, that's kind of the bioluminescent. And I actually specifically was trying to look up. I was like, well, what would it likely be? And then when I looked up green bioluminescent, I was like, oh, dude, like all of this would be reasonable. There was like 20 different examples. I'm like, it could be any of these, and they're all equally viable. One of them was like a jellyfish, like a byproduct, you know, that was like bioluminescent green. I'm like, I could see that, especially because King's Landing, which is where they're making this stuff, is right on the sea. You know, so be like, oh yeah, they have access to all of that, right? So the question is, now we've decided that they could, in theory, but would they? And I think that that's a very challenging question, because you could easily make the argument of, no, they wouldn't. They're a medieval level society, and in our medieval level society, where we spent hundreds of years waging war, we never made napalm until the 1960s, right? So why did they? And I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because I have my own theory that I think holds water. But what do you think would be a key difference between Game of Thrones universe versus our universe? And yours may be as valid or more valid than my theory.
So my first thought, and it has been a little while since I watched the show, and I never read the books, don't at me. I could imagine people accelerating advancement in certain ways, probably hostile ways, right? In a universe where basically everything that is magic is like violent and hostile and harmful, right? You have the White Walkers and the Night King and dragons, which breathe fire in some kind of like magical, unbelievable way, right? And they left her out of the show, but I think when Eddard's wife gets murdered, she becomes like a zombie, and she's like Lady Stoneheart or something. So like basically every single thing that's shown to be magic, they don't have like, nobody snaps their fingers and lights all the candles in a room, right? Nobody waves their wand and is like, we had one chicken, but now we have 8 chickens. Everyone can have the favorite part of the chicken when we feast tonight. Like there's no magic that I remember seeing that is like that. Everything is completely mundane except for like the horror, right? And so I could imagine someone saying, we need to advance our science a little bit, our like technology a little bit, because we have to combat the horror. Like if the Night King comes, we can't fight him with conventional weapons. He's magically horrible. So we need to have something that is either also magically horrible or feels as powerful as magic horror. So that would be like, I know arms race is not like the most novel, but it's also something humans do a lot. We have arms races are bad, and keeping up with the Joneses is bad, but like you don't keep up with the Joneses by like napalming their house. You just buy a bigger car.
Right. But to be fair, if the Joneses created a way to blow stuff up, you might want to create a better way to blow stuff up, you know?
Actually, you know what? We're both American, raised in America, and people in the suburbs absolutely do that, because you had a big fireworks display last year. I'm going to have a bigger fireworks display this year.
Yes. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. But if I take both of their eyes first, then we're fine.
Still averages out to, one eye per person.
Yeah, one eye per person. Yeah. Math is fun. So yeah, no, I really like that. I like that theory a lot, because I think that, and I think that your theory actually can mesh with mine. So I think we can both be right. Because to me, as I was just like, okay, so like, let's say that you're like, oh, I found this weird oil garbage on the ground that catches fire. what other cool stuff could I do with it? So you go, you pick it up, and you kind of run some crude experiments on it. And then, you know, what happens? You die at the age of 50, right? And then all of your work is gone, right? Because there's nobody. First of all, you need to have the resources in order to even fund a guy to go do this stuff, right? And then the amount of money, time, energy, and resources that go into research for research's sake is not profitable, right? Even if you're looking at it from like I'm trying to make a method of war. It's like, you know, I'm going to create a sharper or longer stick. I'm not going to try to create something that may have benefit 10 years from now. So what you would need is an organization whose sole purpose it is to forward and retain knowledge, which did not exist in our medieval level society, right? There were small organizations that did, but because of all the different nations, there wasn't one universal, like across all of the nations, a neutral third party that retained all of this knowledge and continued to try to push it forward. The Maesters Guild, on the other hand, in Game of Thrones, does exactly that.
Yeah, they are basically a university.
And they're a university without borders. Every one of the kingdoms has a maester assigned to their keep. You know, like there's a whole guild. They have a whole system with chains, which I think is kind of, I don't know much about it, but like they like add links to the chain as they like master different things. And they have like the grand library where all of this information is retained. And so I think that that's one of the critical pieces, and the critical pieces that's missing is that like if you had somebody in the Maesters Guild who was like, hey, I did a bunch of experiments and I got a whole bunch of different fluids and different ones burn at different rates, then maybe somebody 20 years later could pick that up. And it is specifically a sect of, I believe it's a sect of the Maesters, but if not, it's somebody who specializes in this, where that's what they do. They make wildfire, right? So it'd be very easy to say like, oh, okay, well, we took all this stuff from the Maesters Guild, took all this knowledge, and now there's a special sect that does this specific thing. So I do think that from your, as you said, like, I think that not only having the Maesters to give them the foundation to jump off and actually create this technology helps a lot, but then also the necessity of combating crazy, evil, wild magic, you know, to create this thing. And also, too, one of the things that they said is that when the dragons died out, that's part of how the Targaryens kept their power, because they, you know, were relying very heavily on dragons to keep everyone in line, because it's not love that keeps them in line, Ned. It's fear and blood, you know? So
they over-indexed on dragons.
So when, you know, all the dragons died out, they had yet another need for this stuff. So I can see all of that propelling the need, and then the Maesters Guild giving them the means by which to do this research.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you thought about it from that angle, because I had forgotten about the Maesters Guild, and I remember now watching the show that it's kind of a really accurate and really sad indictment of like why private knowledge is dangerous, because they have all of their funding comes from them being patronized by like these rich monarchies, right? And these like noble families. And it's like, okay, so your organization, which is supposed to be without borders and supposed to not like pay heed to any one nation, all of your funding comes from these like monastic dynasties. So that's probably going to bias you a little bit, right? Like we're not democratically electing the king of King's Landing, right? It's a monarchy. So if that king is like, you know, we need a lot more of, like way more of wildfire. And it's like, but my lord, we're at peace. We haven't seen a war in 2 winters. Yeah. Make more wildfire though, just in case, right? Like that's going to kind of bias where you invest and where you research. But I think you're spot on that without an organization like that, right? Without a university where this guy says, oh, hey, 30 years ago, you know, George the Great discovered this material and it could do this thing. And then decades later, an entirely different person is just combing through the shelves and is like, fire. This stuff catches on fire. Okay. What can I do with this? The king really wants to set people who are far away on fire. How do I use this to inform that? So yeah, I think you're spot on.
Yeah, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And there are so many other things too that could potentially play into it, including like the availability of oil, so like, for example, in Westeros, it could just be that there's a lot of oil at near surface levels, so it's just a lot easier for people to get a hold of and start messing around with. Whereas, so I think that one of the interesting things that, again, it's fascinating, is during the Bronze Age, there was like the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and like a couple of others, the Mycenaean Empire, I think, as well. But I believe it was, and don't at me on this because I'm just doing my best off the top of my head. I believe it was the Assyrian Empire that basically the only reason why they were an empire and could even claim to have similar footing of the other ones is because they had access to, in that region, the only concentrated access of tin, which is required to make bronze. And so everyone had to trade with them. And because of that, they became this empire of trade, and so like that resource, where it was, completely shaped history, and what we did with it, and. So, with that in mind, it is also too, you could say like, oh well, this was an oil rich area, or even, and it even could have been something as simple and as stupid as, the oil rich area was near where the Maester's University was, so they had a whole lot of this substance to mess around with for a long time until somebody said, hey, we can create explosives with this, and somebody said, oh, okay, cool. The king wants a lot of that, like too much of it. Give me it. Yeah, and also one of the things I think is very interesting and important in the way that it's set up is that kind of what is the whole book is about is that the kingdoms are knit together because they're all constantly looking to murder each other. But what it is it's very similar to, and I know it's based off of, a specific war in European history that I'm unfamiliar with.
Roses?
Yeah, that sounds right. But also another one that it makes me think of is the Sengoku Jidai from Japan, right? The Warring States era, where like you had, I don't know, like 14, 20 different houses. And the thing is it's like, well, why didn't one house take them all over? And it's like, well, eventually one did. But most of the reason why is because the minute that person A left their territory to attack person B, person C behind them would attack them. So it's like, okay, well, I can't do anything because the minute I move, somebody moves to attack me. So I'm just going to stand here. And it's this perpetual uneasy truce. But having a university that is associated with all of the kingdoms, right? Then there's nothing, it's not like, oh, I sacked King's Landing and burned the library to the ground, right? Because it's like, that's something that would piss off everyone. So like, no one's going to do that, as opposed to like, so like when the University at Byzantium was, the library at Byzantium was destroyed, that was the Byzantine library, So like when Byzantium fell, so did it. But this is independent of all of that stuff. So they're kind of like in the middle of the House of Cards and being like, hey, don't attack us, because then that's a suicide mission,
Look, it's us, Switzerland. Please leave us alone while you do your dragon zombie thing over there.
Absolutely. But yeah, overall, that was my best guess, is that one, it is napalm, and could I believe it's napalm not only because of the properties that it seems to have by observation, but it is reasonable to think that with the Maester's Guild in place, with all of the horrible magics that they were trying to combat, and with the materials that it takes to make napalm, that it would be reasonable that they could have made it.
Yeah, and I think that's the most upsetting part, because I thought for sure once you started down that path, you were going to have to do a bunch of like, well, what has similar properties? What could you accomplish something similar with? And the answer is the same thing. You know what works like napalm? Napalm works like napalm. Works just like napalm, actually. It's a dead ringer.
Oh, and the one other thing that I was thinking of is because like the bioluminescent portion, the green bit, right? That doesn't add anything to it,
That you know of.
That I know of, right? But like it because of that, though, is I would make the argument that especially at a medieval level society, they would probably say like, oh, okay, hey, I mixed all of this stuff together and I threw in this bioluminescent stuff, especially because magic exists and so on and so forth. They would just be like, we made a thing that works. Let's keep making it that way, And then it's bioluminescent green. Or also they could have just been like, somebody said like, hey, I made this thing. It's called wildfire. And some Targaryen said, yeah, it needs a little pop,
It needs some pizzazz. Was the Targaryen flag green?
No.
God, I hope it's green. Black. I want that flag to be green so goddamn bad right now.
I think it's black and red, I want to say. I feel like the yeah, it's a bummer. I also like the idea too that like some maester somewhere was like, man, we're running low on funding. We need another revenue of funding. And somebody's like, well, I created this like kind of stuff that catches things on fire. It's like, what, this like gross kind of black grayish goo? Man, no one's going to buy that. We got to market this better. Dude, there's a whole bunch of jellyfish just like right outside.
right off of King's Landing. My swag would be that you would want to strike fear into the hearts of your enemies, right? So they see green fire and it's like, oh my God, green fire. But also you want to know not to go over there, right? If you see something on fire and you're like, what color's the fire though? It's like, oh, it's a demonic green. We're not going over there. We're going to wait till that sorts itself out.
Yeah. Wait till that just kind of burns itself all down. Yeah, and cosine, all of that.
No, this is good. This does remind me of some other weapons of reconciliation I want to ask you about, though.